You know, medieval Europe wasn't exactly a quiet place. Sure, it looks peaceful in those old paintings. Stone castles, green fields, people in funny hats. But the truth is, the Middle Ages were loud, strange, and full of stories that made people either curious or terrified. And here's the best part. A lot of those stories weren't just stories. Many of them had something real behind them. Real events, real people, real weirdness. That's what we're here for tonight. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. I'm your soft-spoken guide for the night, and together we'll drift back in time to a world where truth and legend got so tangled up no one could tell them apart anymore. So grab your blanket, let your phone brightness drop just a bit, and let's step quietly into the shadows of the medieval night. Imagine you're walking through a medieval town around 1300. There's no internet, no Netflix, not even one streetlight, just cold stone walls and the sound of your neighbor's goat. At night, people gathered around fires and told stories. But these weren't fairy tales like Disney gives us now. These were stories whispered with wide eyes. Stories people believed, about strange children with green skin, about a rats following a piper, about a sword stuck in a rock, about a man so scary they turned him into Dracula centuries later. And the best part? Many of those legends turned out to be at least partly true. See, in the Middle Ages, people didn't exactly have breaking news. When something weird happened, like a whole crowd dancing in the street for no reason, or a beast attacking the village, the story spread through gossip, travelers, and church sermons. And with each telling, it got juicier. A missing child became a curse, a local knight became a hero who slayed dragons, and an odd illness became the work of witches. But here's the twist. When modern historians started digging through old records, dusty letters, and even digging up the ground, they discovered that a lot of these legends weren't just campfire nonsense. There were real events hiding underneath the layers of spooky drama. Before we jump into the legends themselves, let's clear something up. Medieval people weren't silly. They believed these things for a reason. If you saw a group of people dancing uncontrollably in the middle of the night and you had no idea what a neurological disorder was, well, you might believe the devil was throwing a party. If your town's children suddenly vanished one day and the only clue was a story about a mysterious man with a flute, you'd probably tell that story too. You'd pass it down. You'd warn others. And centuries later, those warnings became legends. Tonight, we'll travel through 15 of the strangest, creepiest, and most fascinating medieval legends that weren't just bedtime stories. Each one has a real event hiding behind it. Some proven by records, some supported by archaeology, and some are still wrapped in mystery. We'll talk about a dancing fever that took over a city, a piper who led children away, a real sword in a real stone, a prince who inspired Dracula, and beasts, green children, ghost bells, and more. But don't worry, this isn't a horror story. Think of it more like sitting by a warm fire while someone tells you the weirdest history lesson ever, very slowly. Let's be honest. History can be boring sometimes. Wars, kings, taxes, not exactly pillow talk. But legends have personality. They're history's way of saying, hey, something strange happened here, and we never quite forgot it. What makes these stories so special is how they mix fact and fear, truth and rumor, real events, and a touch of medieval drama. Like, imagine someone centuries from now digging through old tweets and deciding memes were sacred rituals. That's kind of how medieval legends work. A spark of reality plus a lot of imagination. Another thing that makes these legends so powerful is how they lasted. Think about it. People didn't have printing presses in the early Middle Ages, no phones, not libraries in every town. And yet, these stories survived. They traveled from mouth to mouth, from village to castle, from century to century. That means they mattered to people. And when something matters that much, chances are something real is at the heart of it. Some legends are easy to trace. We have written records from monks, travelers, or local officials who described what they saw. Others are buried in folklore, songs, or strange carvings on church walls. Either way, every legend is like a message in a bottle from the past, and tonight we're opening 15 of them. As we move through each chapter, I'll tell you the story first, the way medieval people might have told it. Then we'll slowly peel it apart, like layers of an onion, until we find the real event inside. Sometimes the truth will be clear. Sometimes it'll still be a little blurry. But that's okay. Legends aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to make us wonder. We'll start our journey with something weird. You've probably heard of plagues, the kind with fevers and sneezing and way too much coughing. But have you ever heard of a plague that made people dance until they dropped? Yeah, medieval Europe really said, let's make history a musical. The year was 1518 in a city called Strasbourg, which back then was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was summer, warm, a little too warm, and everyone was going about their daily business, baking bread, praying, complaining about taxes. Normal medieval stuff. Then, something strange happened. One woman, known in history as Frau Trophia, stepped out into the street. Nothing weird about that. But then she started dancing. Not the fun kind of dancing. Not like a festival jig or a tavern shuffle. She was dancing alone, with no music, in the middle of the street. And she didn't stop. Not after an hour. Not after a night. She kept dancing. At first, people thought, oh, she's just in the mood. Maybe she's celebrating something. But after a full day, it was clear. This wasn't a normal party. She couldn't stop. Within a few days, more people joined her. Dozens of them. Men, women, young people. They moved their feet day and night like some invisible DJ was controlling their legs. Some danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. And when they woke up, they kept dancing again. Historians call it the dancing plague of 1518. The people living through it just called it terrifying. You see, back then, people believed in curses, saints, and devils way more than germs or psychology. So when they saw people dancing uncontrollably, they thought maybe Saint Vitus had cursed them. Others said it was the work of demons. And because it was the Middle Ages, instead of sending people to doctors, they decided the solution was more dancing. Yeah, no joke. City officials built a stage, brought in musicians, and tried to dance the curse away. Imagine being cursed to dance, and the government basically says, you know what will fix this? A concert. But the situation wasn't funny for the dancers. They danced until their feet bled. Some collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Some had heart attacks. The records don't agree on the number of deaths, but we know it was bad. The city went from confused to panicked. They tried everything. Some believed the curse came from Saint Vitus, so they carried the dancers to a shrine dedicated to him, hoping prayer would help. Others thought it was punishment for sins. And some just avoided the streets. For weeks, Strasbourg became a strange, nightmarish dance floor. Now here's the big question. What actually happened? For a long time, people assumed it was just a silly story. But historians dug into city archives, church records, and eyewitness accounts. And guess what? The dancing plague really happened. It's one of the best documented mass hysteria events in history. One theory is that the dancers suffered from a mass psychogenic illness, kind of like a panic attack that spread from one person to another. Imagine stress so intense that your body just takes over. And 1518 wasn't exactly a happy year. The city had been hit by famine, disease, and heat waves. People were tired, poor, and scared. That kind of pressure can do strange things to the human brain. Another theory says it might have been ergot poisoning, a toxic fungus that grows on wet rye bread. This fungus can cause hallucinations, twitching, and convulsions, basically a medieval bad trip. Some historians believe many of the dancers were actually hallucinating. But there's something important here. Not everyone agrees on just one explanation. It might have been stress, or poisoned bread, or religious hysteria, or maybe a messy mix of all three. Whatever the cause, it was real. Real people danced until they couldn't anymore. The city eventually shut down the dance floor. Authorities banned music, closed the guild halls, and carried the exhausted dancers to a shrine in the mountains. Slowly, the dancing stopped. The streets grew quiet again. But the legend didn't go away. How could it? Imagine living in a small medieval town and seeing hundreds of people just dancing for weeks. No TikTok, no festivals, just chaos and tired feet. The dancing plague of 1518 became one of those stories whispered at night. Parents warned their kids, don't make fun of the saints, or they'll make you dance like Frau Trophäa. Centuries later, artists, poets, and musicians turned the story into plays and songs. Modern historians turned it into research papers. And bedtime storytellers like me, well, we turned it into quiet little stories you listen to in the dark. But let's pause for a second. Think about how fragile reality was back then. No one knew what germs were. No one understood mental health. If something weird happened, it quickly became legend. And the wildest part, some legends didn't fade away. They grew. They traveled. They became part of history. Even now, people still argue about what really caused it. Was it a psychological chain reaction, a curse in people's minds, bad bread, or something else entirely? The truth is, we'll probably never know for sure. But the documents are clear. The dancing happened. People saw it. They recorded it. The legend is real. The event is real. And somewhere in the archives of Strasbourg, the name Frau Trophäa is still written down next to the date, 1518. Let's travel back to Hamelin, a small German town. The year, 1824. Picture narrow streets, pointed roofs, and people wearing those funny medieval hats that look way too uncomfortable. Chickens walking around like they own the place. A few rats here and there. Actually, not a few. A lot of rats. The town had a rat problem. And I don't mean one in the kitchen. I mean rats running across the streets like it was their city. They chewed grain, they spread disease, and honestly, they were just bad neighbors. The people of Hamelin didn't know what to do. Cats? Not enough. Traps? Didn't work. Prayers? Apparently the rats didn't care. And then he showed up. One bright summer day, a man walked into town. He wore a long, colorful cloak. Some say red, some say yellow, some say multicolored like a medieval rainbow. He carried a flute, and he called himself a rat catcher. He told the townspeople, for a price, I can make your rat problem disappear. The mayor thought this was a great deal, probably cheaper than fixing the sewers. So they made a promise. If he gets rid of the rats, they'll pay him a big reward. The man smiled, lifted his flute to his lips, and began to play. Now here's where the story gets magical. As the tune filled the streets, something strange happened. The rats, all of them, came running. From cellars, barns, attics, even from under floors. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. They followed the sound of the flute like a medieval conga line. The man kept walking, leading them out of the city, all the way to the river Weser. When they reached the water, the rats jumped in and drowned. Hamelin was saved. The townspeople cheered. The mayor probably started thinking about how not to pay him. When the piper returned for his payment, the mayor refused. He said, "You played a little song. It wasn't that hard." Big mistake. Never make a deal with a mysterious flute guy in a colorful cloak. The piper left the town silently. But then, a few days later, he came back. This time, he wore a darker cloak. And this time, he didn't play for rats. He played for the children. As the eerie tune floated through the streets, something unbelievable happened. The children, all the boys and girls of Hamelin, started following him, just like the rats had. He walked out of the city. Some versions of the legend say he led them to a mountain, others say a cave, some say the ground opened up. Either way, the children vanished, just like the rats. Only a few children were left behind, one because he was lame and couldn't walk, another because he was deaf and didn't hear the tune, and one because he was scared and turned back. And when the adults finally realized what happened, it was too late. The piper and the children were gone.
That's the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. It's a story told for centuries, whispered to children as a warning. Keep your promises. Don't mess with mysterious strangers. And maybe avoid flute players in bright cloaks. But here's the thing. This isn't just a fairy tale. Something real happened in Hamelin. Historians have dug into this legend for years, and there's some solid evidence behind it. In the town of Hamelin, there's an actual inscription from the 14th century on an old house. It reads something like this. In the year 1284, on the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children of Hamelin were led away by a piper and were lost. No mention of rats, just children lost. And that's not all. Church records, poems, and town chronicles also mention this event. It was treated as something that really happened, not just a bedtime story. So what's the truth? There are a few theories. Theory 1, a real tragedy. Some historians think the children might have died in a disease outbreak, or maybe they were taken by landslides or floods. Back then, people explained tragedy through stories, and the piper could have been a symbol of death itself. Theory 2, a migration. Other historians believe the children weren't kidnapped, they were recruited. In the late 13th century, many young people were taken from towns like Hamelin to go settle in Eastern Europe. The piper might have been a kind of recruiter, and the disappearance was a mass migration. Theory 3, a mix of myth and memory. Over time, details changed. Rats may have been added centuries later, turning a sad historical event into the story we know today. It's interesting, isn't it? How a single line of writing on an old wall can turn into one of the most famous legends in the world. The Pied Piper story is told in songs, poems, even children's books. But behind the flute and the magic and the rats, there's a real mystery. A town, a date, a number. 130 children gone. No one knows exactly why. But Hamelin never forgot. Even today, if you visit Hamelin, you'll find no music is allowed on bungalows in Strasse, the street without drums. Why? Because that's the street the piper is said to have walked down with the children. For hundreds of years, people have treated it like sacred ground. No loud noises, no music, just silence. Imagine standing there at night, in that quiet street where a whole generation of children once disappeared. This legend shows us something important. Medieval people didn't always separate fact from story. To them, a piper could be death, disease, a recruiter, or maybe just a man with a plan. The legend grew with each telling. Someone added rats, someone added colors, someone made it a moral story for kids. And centuries later, we're still talking about it. All right, let's step away from rats, pipers, and wild dancing feet for a moment. Let's go somewhere quieter, a little village in the 12th century England. The name of the place is Woolpit. And no, it wasn't a town full of wool pits. It got its name from wolf pits, because long ago, people dug pits to catch wolves there. Romantic, right? The year was somewhere around 1150 to 1200, and Woolpit was a small, peaceful farming village, a place where everyone probably knew each other. Sheep were basically celebrities, and the biggest gossip of the day might have been about whose cow got loose.
But then, one day, something truly strange happened. Two children appeared at the edge of the village, a boy and a girl. They didn't look like anyone the villagers had ever seen. Their clothes were made of an odd fabric, something unfamiliar. They didn't speak a single word anyone could understand. And the strangest part of all, their skin was green. Not a healthy, I ate too many peas green, a pale, strange green like plants growing in the shade. You can imagine the villagers' faces. One person probably dropped a bucket, another whispered a prayer. Someone else might have said, well, this isn't in the Bible. But the children seemed lost and confused. They wouldn't eat any of the village food, bread, meat, cheese, nothing. They cried and cried. But when someone offered them freshly picked green beans, they finally ate. That was the only food they accepted at first. People took them in. They didn't know where the kids came from, and the kids couldn't explain it because their language was completely unknown. Some villagers thought they'd wandered out of the forest. Others thought they were fairies. A few probably thought they'd had too much ale. But slowly over time, the children began to learn English. Sadly, the boy grew weaker and eventually died. But the girl survived. She adapted to the village, learned the language, and started telling her story. And that's where the legend really begins to unfold. She said she and her brother came from a land called St. Martin's Land. According to her, in that place, everything was dim and twilight-like, as if the sun never fully rose. The people there were green, just like her and her brother. They heard the sound of church bells in the distance. One day, they followed a strange light through a tunnel or cave and suddenly found themselves in Woolpit. Imagine being a medieval villager hearing that. You'd either be amazed, scared, or both. The story of the Green Children spread. Chroniclers, medieval historians who loved writing down strange things, recorded it in detail. One of the earliest accounts came from a man named William of Newburgh, who was basically a medieval gossip columnist with a lot of ink. Another was by Ralph of Coggeshall, an abbot who loved writing about anything unusual. Both agreed on the basic facts. Two children appeared out of nowhere. Their skin was green. They spoke a strange language. They only ate beans at first. The boy died. The girl survived. She said she came from a twilight land, but neither one of them could explain it. So what really happened? This is where history and mystery dance together. Theory 1. Malnutrition. Modern historians suggest the children might have suffered from chlorosis, also called green sickness, a kind of anemia that gives the skin a pale greenish tint. They might have been poor, lost, and disoriented. The strange language could have just been a regional dialect no one in Woolpit understood. Theory 2. Flemish refugees. Some believe the children were Flemish, possibly orphans. Around that time, many Flemish immigrants lived nearby, and conflicts in the area may have left children abandoned. Their clothes and language would have seemed strange to the villagers, and Woolpit was close to a forest and old mine shafts. They could have wandered through one and emerged near the village. Theory 3. Something more legendary. Of course, some folks love the idea that the children really did come from a mysterious underground world, some kind of medieval parallel dimension. This is less history and more bedtime fun. But hey, it's part of the legend. The girl eventually grew up. Chroniclers say she learned English well, became part of the community, and even worked in service to a local knight. She lost the green color in her skin as she got healthier. She lived an ordinary life in the end, but the story of her arrival never faded. It's strange how two lost children can leave such a huge mark on history.
What makes this legend special isn't just the mystery, it's how detailed the records are. Medieval chronicles are full of miracles, monsters, and saints, but this story reads almost like someone writing down a real event that no one understood at the time. Think about it. If two kids appeared in your town today, speaking an unknown language, wearing strange clothes, and with greenish skin, it'd be on the news in 10 minutes.
Back then, it became a story told for centuries. And maybe that's the magic of this legend. It sits right on the blurry line between real history and otherworldly mystery. Were the children lost refugees, victims of disease, or travelers from some place no one ever found again? No one can say for sure, but the story stuck. It became one of England's oldest and strangest legends. And it reminds us how much the medieval world still surprises us. If you go to Woolpit today, you can still see signs of this legend. There's a village sign with the two green children carved on it. People tell the story on tours. Historians debate it. And of course, storytellers like me turn it into something to fall asleep to. Ah, Robin Hood. When most of us hear that name, we picture a man in green tights, a feathered hat, and a bow that never misses. He's stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, and somehow always outrunning the sheriff. But as fun as that image is, the real story is a little less perfect and a little more grounded in history than you might think. Let's step into England around the 12th and 13th centuries. The country was ruled by kings, knights, and, well, a lot of taxes. And the thing about medieval taxes, they were awful. High taxes, unfair laws, knights taking more than their share, and local officials who were basically just very bossy neighbors with swords. People got angry, very angry. And that's where Robin Hood comes in. The first stories of Robin Hood didn't have him wearing green tights or living in Sherwood Forest with a merry band of men. No, those details came much later. In the earliest ballads, Robin Hood was basically an outlaw hero. He lived outside the law, yes, but he had a sense of justice. He targeted corrupt officials, ambushed tax collectors, and helped poor villagers. In other words, he was exactly the kind of guy medieval peasants would whisper about while hiding in their cottages. I hope he comes here soon. Here's the twist. Historians have found evidence that a man like Robin Hood could have existed. Several real-life figures from the time were accused of crimes like poaching, robbery, and leading bands of outlaws. Records from Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, and Lancashire mention men who stole from the wealthy and helped their communities. No one knows exactly which man inspired the legend, but it's very likely Robin Hood wasn't a single person. He was a composite of several real outlaws, turned into a hero over centuries of storytelling. Now, about the famous stealing from the rich, giving to the poor line, that might be a bit of poetic license. Medieval records show that outlaws sometimes did help their neighbors, probably to gain allies or avoid being reported, but it wasn't exactly a Robin Hood charity plan. Still, the image caught on. People loved the idea of a clever, bold outlaw sticking it to greedy nobles. And yes, there's Sherwood Forest. Sherwood wasn't just a backdrop for adventure. It was a real forest, a dangerous and dense woodland in Nottinghamshire, perfect for hiding from soldiers and planning ambushes. Outlaws often used forests like Sherwood as their home base, so when the stories say Robin Hood lived in the forest, that's probably true. Even the merry men, they were likely inspired by real companions who traveled with outlaws, people who shared food, fought together, and looked out for one another. And the Sheriff of Nottingham? Definitely real, and probably just as grumpy as the stories make him sound. Robin Hood's adventures were first written down in ballads, songs, and poems that people sang or recited. These ballads spread across England, keeping the legend alive for centuries. Over time, details changed. A romantic love story appeared, Maid Marian. The green outfit came later. The number of merry men grew, and Robin became a symbol, not just of a man, but of resistance against injustice. What's really fascinating is how truth and legend blended together. Here's what we know. Outlaws in England really existed. They targeted wealthy, corrupt officials. They sometimes helped the poor or local communities. Forests were used as hideouts. People remembered them in songs and stories. What we don't know is if one person did everything Robin Hood is famous for. Exactly how many adventures were real and how many were made up. Whether he really had a band of loyal friends called the Merry Men. Still, the legend of Robin Hood persists because it resonates. It's not just about archery or theft. It's about fighting unfairness, cleverness, and hope. Imagine being a medieval peasant. You've paid your taxes, your crops barely survived, and the local lord keeps taking more. Then someone like Robin Hood comes along. Even if he wasn't real, he gives you hope. That's why the story survived for so long, and why we're still telling it today in books, movies, and, of course, soft bedtime stories. And let's sprinkle in a little humor here. Think about it. Robin Hood was basically the original anti-hero. No emails, no court cases, no lawyers, just bow, arrow, and some serious improvisation. And yet somehow he became legendary, outlasting kings, wars, and taxes. If Robin Hood had Instagram, he'd have millions of followers by now. Medieval hashtags, hashtag steal from the rich, hashtag forest life, hashtag bogles. In the end, the legend shows how history and myth mixed together. Real people lived, fought, and sometimes became symbols. And over time, their stories grew, adding color, drama, and adventure. Robin Hood is a perfect example of a medieval legend that is rooted in truth, even if the tights and the archery contests were probably invented later. So, when you think of Robin Hood, picture this. Not a perfect hero, but a man, or maybe a few men, who dared to challenge unfairness, and whose story survived centuries. That's more impressive than any arrow shot. And for tonight, as we drift closer to sleep, imagine walking quietly through Sherwood Forest, leaves brushing your shoulders, the wind whispering secrets, and a bow slung over your back. Somewhere in the shadows, Robin Hood's story lingers, not as a perfect hero, but as a real echo of the past, where outlaws could be clever, brave, and unforgettable. Tonight, we're venturing into the darker, creepier side of medieval Europe. Yes, it's time for werewolves. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, just a scary story, hear me out. Because, as usual, the legend has a kernel of truth. We're heading to Poligny, a small town in France around the 16th century. The villagers were your typical medieval people, farmers, bakers, and blacksmiths, trying to live peaceful lives. That is, until a series of mysterious attacks began. It started quietly. People noticed livestock disappearing. Sheep, goats, even dogs went missing. Some animals were found torn apart, and no one saw the culprit. Soon after, villagers reported seeing a strange figure in the forests at night. Sometimes it looked like a man. Sometimes it looked like a wolf. Sometimes, well, both. Stories spread quickly. Villagers whispered by their fires. "It's a werewolf, a cursed man. He's hunting us." And here's a fun medieval twist. In Poligny, the town authorities actually took it seriously. Yes, really. Trials were held, people were questioned. Accused werewolves were often men who were behaving strangely, had odd habits, or were simply the town's scapegoats. One famous case involved a man named Gilles Garnier, who was accused of transforming into a wolf and attacking children. The church and local courts investigated, and documents from the trials survive today. He confessed, under torture, of course, to having supernatural powers and killing multiple children. And medieval people believed him. Now, obviously, no one actually turned into a wolf, but these cases tell us a lot about medieval society. Back then, people believed in the supernatural more than they believed in science. Unexplained events often became evidence of curses or magic. Fear of wolves in the wilderness was very real. Wolves were dangerous, and attacks on livestock were common. Combine real animal attacks, social anxiety, and superstition, and suddenly you get real werewolf hysteria. And it wasn't just Polini. France, Germany, Switzerland, and even parts of England had similar cases. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, hundreds of werewolf trials took place across Europe. People were executed, jailed, or punished for crimes they supposedly committed while in wolf form. It sounds terrifying, and honestly, it was. But here's a little medieval humor. Some of these accused werewolves were old men who just wandered into the forest at night. Some were rebellious teens. Some were people who didn't fit in. And suddenly, they became monsters in everyone's minds. Why do we still remember the werewolves of Polini today? Because this legend shows something very human. How fear and mystery grow into stories that outlast the people involved. The villagers believed a wolfman was stalking them. The courts confirmed it. Chroniclers wrote it down. And centuries later, we can read the documents and think, wow, medieval people really loved their supernatural drama. Modern historians have a few theories. Theory 1. Mental illness. Some accused werewolves might have had conditions like lycanthropy, a psychological disorder where people genuinely believe they transform into animals. Stress, isolation, or trauma could trigger this belief. Theory 2. Criminals hiding behind legends. Some murders, attacks, or disappearances were real, but the accused used the werewolf myth as an excuse. I didn't do it. The wolf made me do it. Not the best alibi, but it seemed believable back then. Theory 3. Real wolves plus superstition. Medieval France had many wolves. Some attacks on livestock, or even humans, were real. When the news spread, people added supernatural explanations. Wolves became monsters in both reality and story. So, the werewolves of Polini were a mix of fact and fear, just like many medieval legends. It's a story about humans trying to make sense of danger, villagers coping with real threats, and societies using myth to explain the unexplainable. And yes, it's also a little scary. But here's the soft part. If you're listening in bed, there's no need to worry about wolves leaping out your window. Think of it like this. These stories aren't just about fear. They're about human imagination. They're about turning mysterious, dangerous things into a story you can tell by the fire, in the comfort of your home. And the werewolf legend is surprisingly consistent across Europe. France, Germany, Switzerland, same fear, same mystery, same myth, just different names and faces. It's like a medieval chain letter. Pass it along, and each time it gets a little stranger. Let's sprinkle in a little humor before we drift deeper. Imagine a medieval trial. The judge is in his robes. The accused man is saying, "Yes, I am a wolf tonight." And the town crier is writing it all down for history. Somewhere, a goat in the corner is just watching and thinking, "Humans are weird." In the end,
The werewolves of Pellini remind us that truth and legend often dance together. Real wolves existed. Real attacks happened. Real people lived in fear. And centuries later, we're still talking about it. Is proof that sometimes history is stranger than fiction, and a little bit of fiction makes it unforgettable. So, tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the quiet forests of 16th century France. Mist curling between the trees, wolves howling somewhere far away, villagers locking doors, whispering prayers, and maybe, just maybe, a man who believed he was a wolf, walking softly in the moonlight. Not to worry, the moon has moved on since then, and you're safe. Let's take a trip to Tuscany, Italy, in the late 12th century. Rolling hills, olive trees, and quaint medieval villages. Perfect for a story about knights, magic, and, yes, swords stuck in stones. Now, before you say, "Ah, like King Arthur," hang on. This one is real. Well, mostly. We're talking about San Galgano Abbey and a sword lodged in a stone on a hill outside the monastery. And it's not just a legend. It's actually there. You can see it today. Rusted, ancient, but very much real. The story begins with a man named Galgano Guidotti, born around 1148. He was a typical medieval nobleman. Young, strong, a little reckless, and maybe a bit self-centered. As the story goes, Galgano led a life full of worldly pleasures, hunting, fighting, enjoying the luxuries of a nobleman's life. But one day, something changed. Legend says he had a vision of the archangel Michael. The angel told him to abandon his violent, selfish ways and dedicate his life to God. Galgano, like a true medieval hero, didn't just say, "Okay," and go back to the castle. No. He took it seriously. So seriously that he did something very dramatic. He plunged his sword into a rock on a hill near his home. Yes, a real sword, a heavy, iron sword, stuck in solid rock. And then he walked away. The sword stayed there. Still does. Over 800 years later, people can touch it, lean on it, and wonder how a man could make such a bold gesture without modern tools. It's one of the few legendary swords in stone stories outside of the Arthurian myth. But this one is documented in historical records, not just fairy tales. Galgano's decision was more than dramatic flair. It marked the beginning of his new life as a hermit. He lived simply, praying, helping the local community, and meditating on spiritual matters. People admired him, and stories of his piety spread. He became almost a local saint while alive. After his death, Galgano was canonized, meaning the church officially recognized him as a saint. Pilgrims came to see his tomb, and the sword remained as a symbol of his renunciation of violence. Imagine that. A man goes from reckless nobleman to saint, leaving behind a sword in stone, probably thinking, "This will teach me to stay humble."
Now, of course, skeptics have their say. Some historians believe the sword might have been placed in the stone later as a symbolic relic to attract pilgrims. Others suggest it could have been stuck there naturally and later tied to the story of Galgano. But whether by miracle, clever planning, or symbolism, the result is the same: a real sword
in a real stone, tied to a real person who left records and legends behind. The Abbey of San Galgano itself adds to the magic. It's now a roofless ruin with tall arches and empty windows that frame the Tuscan sky. You can climb the hill, see the sword, and feel a strange mix of awe and quiet calm. Walking there, it's easy to imagine Galgano plunging his sword into the stone, leaving behind his past life and stepping into a world of faith and legend. And let's sprinkle in a little humor, because why not? Imagine medieval Tuscany. Galgano yanks his sword from the scabbard with dramatic flair, stabs it into a rock, and his neighbors probably thought, is he serious? Did he just quit? Wait, did he just invent a medieval IKEA project? Sword in rock, assembly required? Yes, medieval people had a sense of humor, even if it was mostly in whispers. What makes this legend fascinating is how it's both historical and symbolic. Historical, Galgano Guidotti was a real person. He lived, renounced violence, and became a saint. Symbolic, the sword and the stone represents leaving worldly life behind. It's a visual story of transformation and faith. And centuries later, people still tell the story, proof that sometimes legends are just history with a touch of drama. Even today, pilgrims and tourists walk up that hill. They touch the rusted sword, take photos, and wonder, did he really do it? How strong was this guy? Could I even lift it? Spoiler, probably not. And in the quiet of the Tuscan hills, the story feels alive. History and legend meet perfectly, like light filtering through the abbey's ruined arches. So, for tonight, as you lie in bed, imagine it. A man leaves behind violence, plunges a sword into a rock, and starts a life devoted to peace. The wind whispers through the ruins, the stone remains silent, and the sword stands as a real monument to a real legend. It's quiet, it's strange, it's medieval, and it's true. If you've ever heard of Dracula, you probably imagine a pale man with fangs, a cape, and a dramatic stare. But long before Bram Stoker wrote his famous novel, there was a man who inspired it, a real historical figure named Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Yes, he was real, and yes, some of the legends about him are terrifyingly true. Vlad was born in 1431 in Transylvania, part of modern-day Romania. He was a prince, which in medieval times meant lots of fancy dinners and a really dangerous life. See, Vlad's father and grandfather were rulers, but power in Wallachia was messy. Nobles fought constantly, enemies invaded, and betrayal was around every corner. Vlad had to learn how to survive, and he learned it in the most intense way imaginable. Vlad got his nickname the Impaler for a very direct reason. He liked to stick his enemies on wooden stakes. Yes, like big, pointy spikes. And he did it for several reasons: intimidation, punishment, and as a warning to anyone thinking about crossing him. Chroniclers of the time described villages of enemies being lined up along roads, impaled for all to see. Now, I know what you're thinking. Is this a bedtime story? Don't worry, we're keeping it calm and storytelling friendly. Just imagine Vlad as the ultimate medieval security system, making sure no one messed with his kingdom. His reputation grew fast. Rumors about Vlad spread across Europe. People whispered that he could kill hundreds of enemies in a single night. Some reports claimed that he dined among his impaled victims to scare other nobles. And yes, some of it might have been exaggerated. People love to embellish terrifying stories, but historians agree that Vlad's cruelty was real. He was ruthless in war and punishment, and he did use impalement as a tool of power. But here's the twist. Vlad wasn't just a brutal tyrant, he was also a protector of his people. Wallachia faced invasions from the Ottoman Empire, and Vlad defended his land fiercely. He was strategic, clever, and sometimes surprisingly generous to loyal subjects. So, in a weird way, Vlad was a hero to some people and a nightmare to others. Think of him like a medieval dark knight, scary but effective. Now, let's talk about the connection to Dracula.
Bram Stoker, writing in the 19th century, never met Vlad, but he read about him in European history books and folktales. Stoker borrowed Vlad's nickname, reputation for cruelty, and the fear factor, and then added vampires, capes, and castles. So, Dracula, the vampire, is fiction. Vlad, the Impaler, is history. But they share the same legendary aura, terrifying, unforgettable, and larger than life. Historians still debate, why did Vlad impale so many people? Theory 1. Military strategy. He needed to maintain control and prevent rebellion. Impalement was brutal, but it was effective. Roads lined with spikes. Very discouraging if you were thinking about invading. Theory 2. Psychological warfare. Vlad understood fear. It's easier to rule when your enemies are terrified. And let's be honest, medieval politics were intense. Theory 3. Personal code of justice. Vlad was strict about loyalty. Betrayal wasn't tolerated. Impalement was a warning. Break the law, and you'll face the consequences. Very sharply. And here's a little medieval humor, if you can call it that. Imagine being an enemy soldier in Wallachia, hearing that Vlad is coming. You arrive at a village, and the first thing you see is dozens of people on spikes. You'd probably rethink your life choices, or at least pack lighter for the trip. Vlad's reign didn't last forever. He faced betrayals, lost battles, and political intrigue. But he died as he lived, surrounded by legend. Today, his castle ruins in Ponari are open to visitors. And yes, you can climb to the top and imagine the forests stretching below where Vlad once planned battles and defended his land. What makes this story interesting for us today isn't just the gore, it's how history inspired legend and how human imagination transformed a real man into a fictional vampire. Vlad was real. Impalement was real. Cruelty and strategy were real. The vampire with fangs, that's the bedtime story we added later. And for tonight, imagine medieval Transylvania. Dark forests, mist over the hills, villages lit by torchlight, and a prince walking silently through the streets. Everyone knows him. Everyone fears him. And somewhere, history begins to whisper a story so strange, it becomes legend. Tonight, we step into one of the darkest and most infamous chapters of medieval history, the Black Plague, also called the Black Death. It wasn't a legend at first, it was terrifyingly real, but the stories and myths that grew around it became legendary, shaping how people remembered and feared this deadly event.
The year was 1347, and Europe was about to face something unprecedented. It started in the east, traveling along trade routes. Ships, merchants, and yes, rats carried the deadly bacteria. Cities weren't clean. Sewers ran in the streets. Fleas thrived on rats. Humans had very little idea what they were dealing with. And then, it spread. Within months, towns and villages began to empty. People fell ill, sometimes dying within days. The plague caused fever, vomiting, and horrifying black spots on the skin. And just like that, a third, maybe half of Europe's population vanished in a few short years. Now, here's where the legends kick in. People didn't know why this was happening. Medicine was limited. Doctors wore strange masks shaped like birds, thinking it would keep evil spirits away. Some thought it was a curse from God. Others blamed Jews, foreigners, or witches. You could imagine the chaos. Fear led to myths and stories that made the plague legendary long before it was fully understood. One of the most famous legends is the Dance of Death, or Dance Macabre. Art from the time shows skeletons leading people to their graves, reminding everyone that death comes for everyone, rich or poor. Nobleman, peasant, king or beggar, no one could escape. This wasn't just creepy art, it reflected reality. People were literally seeing death everywhere. Streets empty except for mourners, cemeteries overflowing, and bodies buried hastily in mass graves. Another legendary story? The flagellants. Groups of people traveled from town to town, whipping themselves in public, hoping God would spare them from the plague. They thought punishment of the flesh could prevent disease. It didn't work, of course, but the image is striking. Medieval men and women walking solemnly, bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, convinced they could outsmart fate. In a way, it's a reminder of how humans try to control the uncontrollable, a lesson still relevant today. But here's the historical truth behind the legends. The Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacteria transmitted by fleas on rats. It traveled along trade routes, spreading rapidly through cities and towns. High mortality rates and poor sanitation made it unstoppable. Myths and legends grew because people needed to make sense of something terrifying. So while stories about curses, dancing skeletons, and divine punishment sound like myths, they all have a real event at their core. And here's the human side. Families were torn apart. Villages lost entire generations. People didn't just fear death, they feared loneliness, betrayal, and survival. Some survivors told stories about miraculous escapes. Others spoke of angels guiding them or visions warning them of danger. These stories passed through generations, eventually merging with folklore. By the time you get to the 15th century, the plague wasn't just remembered as a disease. It became legendary, a story to warn, to scare, and sometimes to teach. Let's add a touch of humor. Dark, but still medieval friendly. Imagine a medieval villager hearing about plague rumors. Stay away from rats, wash your hands, pray, don't dance too much. And honestly, people tried, in ways both practical and absurd. Sometimes they burned incense, sometimes they carried herbs, sometimes they just ran away. Humans have always done what they can when the world feels out of control. And stories help us process fear, even centuries later. Interestingly, the plague also changed society. Labor shortages gave peasants more bargaining power. Art and literature reflected new themes of mortality and the fleeting nature of life. Public health slowly became more of a concern in towns and cities. So, in a strange way, one of the deadliest events in human history also shaped culture and progress. The legends that grew from the Black Plague remind us that history isn't just dates and numbers. It's also stories, fears, and human imagination. When medieval people drew skeletons, sang songs about death, or whipped themselves in town squares, they were turning their experience into memory, into something that could survive the centuries. And even today, we feel echoes of it. The phrase "dance of death," images of grim skeletons, and the fascination with pandemics in books and movies all come from the real events of the Black Plague. The legend and the history are intertwined. One cannot exist without the other. So, as you lie in bed tonight, imagine 14th century Europe. Empty streets, silent villages, churches echoing with prayers, and people trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly turned deadly. The plague may have been terrifying, but it also created stories, and those stories still whisper across time, reminding us of resilience, fear, and the human need to explain the unexplainable. Tonight, we're venturing into the world of miracles, legends, and a little bit of medieval weirdness. Our story takes place in France around the 3rd century, but the legend has been told and retold throughout the Middle Ages. It's the story of Saint Denis, the patron saint of France, and his, well, flying head. Yes, you read that correctly, a flying head. Don't worry, we'll keep it calm. Saint Denis was the first bishop of Paris, a religious leader who spread Christianity at a time when it wasn't exactly popular. In fact, it could get you executed. The Roman authorities didn't appreciate new religions, and Denis was beheaded for preaching. Harsh, but historically plausible. People were not big fans of change back then. Here's where the legend begins. After Dennis was executed on the hill of Montmartre, something miraculous happened. According to medieval accounts, Dennis picked up his own head. Yes, he literally held it in his hands. And then, walking several miles, he carried it to the place where he wanted to be buried. That location eventually became the site of St. Denis Basilica, one of the most important religious sites in France. Now, let's pause and visualize this. Medieval peasants probably heard this story and reacted with, "Wait, the man's head, walked? Should we kneel or run? Is this holy or just very weird?" It's strange, yes, but it was a story of faith, devotion, and miracles which were taken seriously in the Middle Ages. What's fascinating is that there's historical evidence supporting parts of the legend. Dennis was real. He was Bishop of Paris. He was martyred by Roman authorities. His burial site became an important religious location. The miraculous part, the walking head, is symbolic, but
The story of Saint Denis also influenced art and architecture. In medieval manuscripts, you'll see illustrations of Denis walking with his head in his hands. It's one of the earliest depictions of a martyr performing a posthumous miracle. Even today, visitors to Saint Denis Basilica can see statues, carvings, and paintings that honor the legend, reminding people of courage and faith in the face of danger. Let's sprinkle a little humor before we get too solemn. Imagine being a Roman soldier witnessing Denis after his execution. You'd probably drop your sword, faint, and think, did that man just pick up his head and walk? Medieval soldiers were probably like, yep, another day in France. Soft chuckle. Yes, medieval people had a taste for the dramatic, but stories like these were also meant to teach and inspire. The flying head of Saint Denis is a great example of how truth and legend mix in medieval history. Historical truth? Denis existed, was executed, and became an important religious figure. Legend, the walking head miracle. Cultural impact, art, religious devotion, and stories that lasted centuries. This legend shows that medieval people often used miracles to explain the extraordinary, blending real events with symbolic storytelling. So tonight, as you settle into your blankets, imagine Montmartre Hill, a quiet night, the stars above, and Saint Denis holding his head, walking slowly toward the place where his faith would continue to inspire people for centuries. It's strange, yes, but also beautiful. A reminder that sometimes legends grow from real courage, devotion, and the human need to make sense of the world. Tonight, we're traveling to Austria in the early 18th century for one of the most chilling stories from medieval Europe. Yes, it's about vampires, but before you roll your eyes, remember, this one is rooted in history. Legends of vampires were widespread in Eastern Europe, but in Austria, one case became famous and well documented. It all begins in the village of Graz, where locals were living normal medieval lives, farming, trading, and dealing with the occasional flood or tax collector. Then reports started to emerge. People claimed that villagers were falling ill and dying mysteriously. The deceased didn't stay quiet in the grave. Rumors spread that the dead were rising from their graves at night, draining the life and sometimes blood from the living. Yes, blood. One particularly famous case involved a man named Arnold Pauli, a soldier who had returned from service in the Balkans. He died under mysterious circumstances, and soon after, several villagers also died. Fear spread. Superstition and panic gripped the community. They were convinced that Arnold had become a vampire. Now here's where it gets fascinating.
This story isn't just folklore. It's documented in Austrian court records and church documents. Authorities actually investigated, examining graves and interviewing villagers. They found reports of graves disturbed after burial, blood on corpses, villagers reporting strange sightings. Even church officials recommended staking the alleged vampire and burning the body, the classic anti-vampire method. And yes, they did it. The body of Arnold Pauli was exhumed, staked, and burned. What's remarkable is how superstitions intersected with real events. Modern historians believe many of the vampire attacks could have been misunderstood diseases like tuberculosis or plague. Corpses often look different after burial, leading to fears that the dead were active. Panic and fear amplified the story, making it seem like a vampire epidemic. In other words, real science and human imagination collided, creating one of the most famous vampire legends in history. And here's a little medieval humor. Imagine being a villager, walking past a grave and thinking, wait, is that Arnold Pauli sniffing the air for victims? Better carry garlic and a wooden stake just in case. Soft chuckle. Yes, fear made people creative, and the story's unforgettable. Vampire legends like this also influenced art, literature, and cultural imagination. The Austrian vampire case reached beyond the village, inspiring pamphlets and reports read across Europe. By the 18th century, vampire hysteria had spread to Germany, France, and England. Writers and artists picked up the story, blending fact and fiction into what we now recognize as the classic vampire myth. What makes the medieval vampire of Austria particularly fascinating is how carefully it was documented. Unlike many legends, this one has names, dates, and locations, includes reports by church officials and court records, shows a mix of fear, superstition, and attempts at rational investigation. It's one of the rare cases where legend and history overlap perfectly. You can trace the story almost like a detective novel from the village of Graz to the pages of history books centuries later. And let's not forget the human element. Villagers weren't crazy, they were scared. People were dying mysteriously. They had no understanding of disease, and so they turned to legends to explain the unexplainable. Fear, storytelling, and superstition. The perfect recipe for a legend that lasts hundreds of years. Now, imagine a quiet night in medieval Graz. The moon rises over the village, the wind rustles the trees, villagers whisper prayers by candlelight. Graves are dug carefully, and somewhere in the shadows, the story of Arnold Pauli lingers. Not as fiction, but as a memory of fear, survival, and human imagination. Tonight, we're traveling to Hamelin, Germany in the late 13th century for a story you probably know from fairy tales, the Pied Piper. But as you'll see, the truth is often stranger and a little darker than the storybook version. The legend says that Hamelin was plagued by rats, thousands of them chewing through food, nests, and just generally causing chaos. The town hired a mysterious man, the Pied Piper, dressed in colorful clothes, to solve the problem. He played his magical flute, leading the rats into the Weser River, where they drowned. When the townspeople refused to pay him, he returned and led away the town's children, who were never seen again. It's a chilling story, but like many medieval legends, there's a kernel of truth behind it. Historical records show that something unusual did happen in Hamelin around 1284. Town records mention the disappearance of a large number of children. Chroniclers describe a mysterious figure or event associated with the disappearance. Over time, the story transformed into the Pied Piper legend we know today. Historians debate what actually happened, but several plausible explanations exist.
Theory 1. Disease or tragedy. Some believe the children might have died from disease or accident, such as drowning in the river or succumbing to illness. The Pied Piper became a symbolic figure, turning a tragic event into a cautionary tale. Theory 2. Migration or recruitment. Another theory is that the children were recruited for work or colonization in Eastern Europe, as was common in the Middle Ages. Some young people left their hometowns for better opportunities or were persuaded to join distant communities. This version aligns with the medieval tendency to wrap historical events in narrative. What's fascinating is how the legend mixes fantasy with social commentary. The rats represent real problems, famine, disease, or social unrest. The piper symbolizes someone clever, resourceful, and potentially vengeful. The children symbolize vulnerability and the consequences of broken promises. In other words, it's not just a story about music and magic, it's a story about human behavior, responsibility, and consequences. Let's sprinkle a little humor for bedtime. Imagine being a medieval townsman. Hire a magical musician to lead away rats? Sure, why not? I mean, he's got a flute. What could go wrong? Soft chuckle. Then, oops, suddenly half your children are gone. Medieval negotiations weren't always smooth. The Pied Piper legend also shows the power of storytelling in medieval Europe. Towns remembered the event through oral stories, songs, and eventually written chronicles. The story adapted over time, adding colorful details, the piper's rainbow-colored clothes, the enchanted flute, and the tragic ending. By the 19th century, authors like the Brothers Grimm and later poets like Robert Browning made the tale famous worldwide. The enduring lesson? Medieval people often explained strange or tragic events through stories, sometimes using supernatural elements to make sense of reality. In Hamelin's case, missing children were terrifying, rats were destructive, and human imagination turned it into a legend that lasts centuries. And here's a little medieval twist of humor for bedtime. Imagine a rat watching the piper leading its friends away. Hey, I didn't sign up for this. Who taught you to play that flute? Or a child whispering, Mom, he's charming, but why are we walking so far? Stories like these were both warnings and entertainment, perfect for medieval storytelling by the fire. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is more than a fairy tale. It's a story with historical roots, social context, and human emotion. Children truly disappeared. The records confirm it. The piper symbolizes a real human tendency to enforce fairness or revenge. The legend evolved to teach lessons, inspire art, and preserve history in a narrative that's easy to remember. So tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, imagine the medieval streets of Hamelin. The moonlight on the cobblestones, the faint sound of a flute in the distance, rats scurrying along the riverbank, children following the piper, unaware of where the music will lead them. It's eerie, yes, but it's also a story of human imagination transforming a real event into legend, a cautionary tale whispered through the centuries. Tonight, we journey to Woolpit, a small village in Suffolk, England, during the 12th century, for one of the most strangest and mysterious stories of the medieval world, the tale of the Green Children. Yes, green, and yes, children.
But there's history behind this bizarre legend, making it even more fascinating. The story begins during harvest time. Villagers working in the fields noticed two children emerging from a wolf pit, a literal pit used for trapping wolves. The children were unusual in more ways than one. Their skin was green. They spoke an unknown language. They wore strange clothes. The villagers were understandably shocked. Green children, weird clothes, and a secret language? That's a lot to process in medieval England. The children were taken to the local lord, Sir Richard de Calne, who tried to feed them. Here's where it gets interesting. They would only eat raw beans at first. Nothing else would do. Eventually, after some patience, they began to eat normal food and lost their green skin color. One of the children, a boy, became sick and died. The girl survived and learned English. Over time, she explained some of her story, or at least as much as the villagers could understand. According to her tale, they came from a place called St. Martin's Land, which was entirely underground. There was perpetual twilight, and everyone there had green skin. Somehow they ended up in Woolpit by accident. It's a story that sounds like a fairy tale, a science fiction plot, or a medieval fantasy. But historians believe there's a kernel of truth behind it. Several theories try to explain the green children. Theory 1. Flemish settlers. Some historians think the children may have been Flemish immigrants or refugees, speaking a language unfamiliar to the villagers. Dietary deficiencies, such as chlorosis, caused by a lack of iron, could explain the green tint of their skin. Theory 2. Misunderstanding and exaggeration. In the 11th century, isolated villages often misunderstood outsiders. Children arriving from a distant or different culture could easily be described as green or strange. Theory 3. Allegory or folklore. The story might have been exaggerated over time, blending real events with symbolic storytelling. Green children representing innocence, otherness, or cultural outsiders. What makes this legend remarkable is how detailed the medieval accounts are. Chroniclers like Ralph of Coggeshall recorded the events carefully. The girl learned English and integrated into society, giving credibility to the story. Local memory preserved the tale, blending fact, legend, and folklore. Unlike many medieval tales, this one leaves traces of real people and events, not just abstract myth. Let's sprinkle a little humor. Imagine villagers in Woolpit seeing two green-skinned children emerge from a wolf pit. Are they fairies? No, too tall. Maybe sprouts. Quick, someone get a pot of beans. Soft chuckle. Medieval life could be strange, but humans always find ways to respond, whether with fear, curiosity, or humor. The story also shows medieval curiosity and hospitality. Villagers fed and cared for the children. They tried to communicate, even when the language barrier was impossible. They preserved the story in chronicles, ensuring it wasn't forgotten. It's a tale of mystery, adaptation, and the human desire to make sense of the unknown. Over centuries, the Green Children of Woolpit have inspired novels, films, television shows, and academic research. The story blends history, folklore, and imagination so seamlessly that it's still captivating today. Children arrive mysteriously. They survive a strange world. Their story becomes legend.
It's a medieval narrative that still resonates.
So, tonight, as you settle under your blankets, picture Woolpit in the 12th century. Soft twilight over the fields. The wolf pit lying quietly in the distance. Two green children stepping cautiously into a strange world. Villagers staring in awe, beans in hand, ready to feed them. It's strange, magical, and historical all at once. A perfect story for medieval bedtime reflection. Tonight, we travel to 14th century Germany for a story of madness, power, and siege warfare. This is the tale of the infamous Mad Count, a figure whose legend still lingers in castle ruins and medieval chronicles. The Count, whose real name was Gottfried von Limburg, ruled a remote castle on a rocky hill. People called him mad, not because he was silly, but because he behaved erratically and dangerously. Stories say he would attack neighboring villages on a whim, lock up his servants for minor mistakes, and hold bizarre festivals where the rules of normal life didn't apply. His reputation spread far and wide, and eventually neighbors decided enough was enough. Around 1370, a coalition of local lords and townsfolk decided to lay siege to the castle. Now, medieval sieges were a serious affair. This wasn't just a few angry villagers with pitchforks. These were armies with ladders, catapults, and boiling oil ready to end the Mad Count's reign. The siege lasted several weeks. The Count tried clever tricks to defend his home. Hidden tunnels, booby traps, and strange psychological tactics. But in the end, reality caught up with legend. Here's where the story gets both terrifying and oddly humorous. The Count allegedly released wild animals into the attacker's camp to cause chaos. Imagine a medieval army suddenly running from a cage of wolves or boars. He reportedly set traps with swinging logs and spikes, creating a deadly obstacle course around the castle. At one point, he even threw a feast from the battlements, hoping to distract or confuse the enemy. Ugh, medieval warfare had its serious moments, but also, apparently, creative madness. Eventually, the Count was captured. Historians say he was imprisoned in his own castle and later died under mysterious circumstances. Yet, his stories of antics became legendary, recorded by chroniclers fascinated by his bizarre behavior and the siege that made him famous. Now, here's the historical truth behind the legend. Gottfried von Limburg was a real figure, known for violent and erratic behavior. The siege was real, and the castle changed hands multiple times over the years. Some of the mad stories may have been exaggerations by neighbors and chroniclers who loved a good story about a crazy nobleman. So, like many medieval legends, it's a mix of fact and folklore. History spiced up with drama and creativity. And let's add a little bedtime humor. Imagine the Count sitting on his throne, watching soldiers get tangled in swinging logs. My genius is unmatched. Meanwhile, a cat sneaks past the defenses and steals his dinner. Reality bites, even for a mad Count. Stories like this remind us that medieval people loved to blend fear, humor, and spectacle in their tales. The siege of the Mad Count's castle also shows us why legends endure. It's about personality. The Count's eccentricity made him unforgettable. It's about conflict. The siege was dramatic, intense, and visually striking. It's about storytelling. Chroniclers turned history into legend, mixing fact with exaggeration to entertain, warn, or inspire. Today, the castle ruins are quiet, overgrown with ivy. But you can still feel the echo of chaos
the ingenuity of traps, and the legend of a madman who defied convention, if only briefly. And here's the reflective part for bedtime. Imagine the hill at sunset. Stones of the castle glowing in soft light. A lone crow circles above. Maybe, just maybe, the mad count still lingers in the imagination of anyone who dares to imagine. It's strange, slightly humorous, and very human. The perfect medieval story for a sleepy mind. So, tonight, as you drift under your blankets, imagine the Mad Count's castle. Tunnels winding underground, traps and swinging logs ready for intruders. A nobleman both terrifying and absurd, whose legend would outlast his life. And remember, sometimes history is stranger, funnier, and more entertaining than fiction. Tonight we end our journey with one of the strangest, eeriest, and yet true events of medieval Europe. Yes, you heard it right. People dancing uncontrollably, sometimes to the point of collapse or death. It happened in July 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, which is now in modern-day France, but was part of the Holy Roman Empire back then. It began when a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the streets and started dancing. At first, people thought it was a bit unusual, but then, day by day, more people joined. Soon, dozens, then hundreds were dancing without stopping. And we're not talking about medieval party dancing. This was involuntary, exhausting, and dangerous. Doctors at the time were baffled. They suggested that the cure was more dancing. Yes, medieval medicine often leaned on the fight fire with fire logic. So they set up a stage and encouraged the dancers to continue, thinking they could dance out the affliction. Sadly, this only made things worse. Some people collapsed, suffered heart attacks, or even died from exhaustion. Modern historians have tried to understand the phenomenon. Some explanations include ergot poisoning. A hallucinogenic mold on rye bread could cause convulsions and hallucinations. Mass hysteria. Psychological stress, poverty, and famine might have caused people to act out collectively. Religious or superstitious belief. Some thought dancing could appease spirits or prevent divine punishment. Whatever the cause, the events are well documented in city records, making the dancing plague one of the strangest true stories of the medieval world. Imagine being a medieval villager. You wake up and neighbors are suddenly dancing uncontrollably in the streets. You ask, "What's going on?" No idea. Maybe the bread? Should I join? It's absurd, terrifying, and historically real. The dancing plague also shows how legends grow from real events. Chroniclers describe the chaos in vivid detail, turning it into a story told for generations. People added mystical explanations, spirits, curses, or divine punishment. Despite the humor and absurdity, there's a serious side. Many people suffered terribly. Families were torn apart. The event reflects the stress and hardship of medieval life, where famine, disease, and social pressures were everyday realities. The dancing plague is a reminder that history can be strange, frightening, and very human. Let's sprinkle a little bedtime humor. Imagine someone trying to sneak past the dancers with a loaf of bread. Just get home quietly. Oh no, now I'm dancing too. Medieval life had its quirks, and this is one of the oddest examples that survived in historical records. By the end of the summer, the plague finally subsided. People were exhausted. Authorities took precautions to prevent it from happening again, mostly by encouraging rest, avoiding crowds, and probably checking rye for mold. But the story lived on. The dancing plague became legendary, a tale of collective hysteria, medieval medicine, and the unpredictability of human behavior. So, tonight, as you lie under your blankets, imagine Strasbourg's cobblestone streets. Hundreds of people dancing involuntarily. The sun beating down on exhausted dancers. Officials scratching their heads, unsure how to stop it. It's strange, terrifying, and fascinating. The perfect ending to a series of medieval legends that actually happened.